So we've had our kelp reproductive tissue in the fridge for around 18 hours. We're going to take the paper towel off the kelp and hopefully we'll start to see some nice spore prints. It means that it was probably releasing when we were collecting the kelp and bringing it back to the lab, which is a good sign for us that we're going to get a good amount of kelp out of that piece. And we're going to work through a few more steps. So we're going to take a beaker or some other kind of glass container. We're going to fill that with a known volume of seawater. We're going to use 500 mils typically, or a liter. And then we're going to take those pieces of kelp reproductive tissue and place them into the seawater. And when that kelp hits that seawater, it's probably going to start releasing the kelp spores. And I'm just grabbing randomly from a variety of pieces of the paper towel so that I'm not grabbing from all one layer, which especially with the smaller pieces. Much like the temperature controls before, we're going to try and keep that seawater at around 10 to 12 degrees Celsius. We're going to leave the reproductive tissue in the water there for about an hour and up to 2 hours. But we do have to be mindful of the temperature. If we need to, we can put that back in the fridge during that hour or two and let the kelp release its spores into that water. So after an hour or two, we can take that reproductive tissue out of the beaker and essentially we can discard that. And the first step is just to make sure that we actually got some spores releasing into the water. Typically you can tell by a change of color in the water. It starts to look kind of like a cup of tea. You get a nice brown color, and looking at it under the microscope allows us to confirm this. So we're going to take those spores and take a little sample of them and put them onto a microscope slide. Generally they'll be swimming around and they move pretty quickly. So we have a hemocytometer slide, and that allows us to count the number of spores, and it's going to give us a known volume and a known number of spores in that volume. We're going to count in a little grid, and we might get 60 spores in a grid, and then that will allow us to calculate how many spores are in that 500 mils of water by using that grid and that known volume. We've looked at our spores under the microscope, and we have figured out what our stocking density of spores is in this release water. It's really, really concentrated. So we need to calculate how much of this concentrated mixture we're going to put into those buckets. So typically we're looking at anywhere from 1,000 spores per mil up to 5,000 spores per mil, and I kind of sit somewhere in the middle of using 2,500 to 3,000 spores per mil when creating the kelp spools. Okay, so on the microscope slides we had 348 spores in our little middle square there. So I'm going to times that by 10,000. That's going to give us the spores per mil in this release beaker. We're going to put our desired stocking density, which we're going to use 3,000 spores per mil in our buckets. Up the top here, we have 3.48 million spores per mil in our release water, and we're going to put that here. And then we're going to use 19 liters in each one of our buckets here. So I'm going to put 19,000 at the bottom here. That gives us 3,000 divided by 183.15, which gives us 16.38 mils of release water to inoculate into each bucket. That is just from this beaker here. So if we use different beakers, which we will, we have to do those counts again, and then we have to do this calculation again. So for each one of these 19-liter buckets, I'm going to be putting 16.38 mils of this release water into this bucket in order to get my 3,000 spores per mil when we top this up with seawater. So our last couple of steps here is just filtering this water through some fine mesh just to catch any mucus or any other particulates that might be in there. And then we're going to measure out our 16 mils of the release water. It's 16 in a bit, so I'm going to do 17 mils just to be on the safe side. And from here, there's a few different methods that we can use. So we're going to focus largely on doing kelp spools for commercial kelp cultivation. I typically do 10 spools at a time, and I'll do it in a 5-gallon bucket. So now we're going to add our 17 mils of this release water into our bucket, and then we're going to top this up with seawater. I'm using a refractometer to measure the salinity of the water, make sure that it's not too fresh and it's not too salty, and it's right on 30 parts per thousand, so that is perfect. So we're going to put the lid on it. Doesn't need to be on too tight, just to keep the light out. So this bucket is then going into this tank of water, which is kept at 10 degrees for 24 hours. And that's going to allow the spores to settle onto those spools. So we are reducing the photo period, and we're controlling the temperature, sticking with that 10 to 12 degree range. Okay, so this is day 3. We're gonna start off by checking the salinity and water quality in our aquaria right here. And then we're going to add nutrients to it, make sure the temperature is right where we want it, around 10 to 12 degrees. And then we can move our spools from our buckets that we had them in overnight directly into our aquaria. If we need to add anything to the tanks, I typically add it into the sump tank at the bottom, and then it just flows around into all of the tanks and mixes nicely in there. And then for our nutrient, we are going to add 1 part of part A and 1 part of part B per 20 gallons. So I have roughly 100 gallons in this system. So we're going to add 50 mils of part A and 50 mils of part B, and that will give us the nutrients that we need to grow our kelp. So our aquaria right here are 20-gallon aquaria. It kind of lets me put 10-ish spools in each one, and it lets me light those aquaria from each side, which gives me nice even kelp growth on those spools, which is awesome. You'll see that there's also lighting, and it's on right now. For the first couple of days, we're just going to leave it at ambient lighting, and then we'll turn those lights on pretty low and ramp the lighting up as the weeks go on, because the kelp's going to need more light as it grows. It's been a couple of weeks since we put the spools in the aquaria. Throughout those couple of weeks, every week we've been looking at the salinity of our water in our aquaria to make sure, just through evaporation, that we're not getting too much change there. We're looking at the pH to make sure that we're not getting any buildup of any nitrates or ammonia levels that we don't want. That also helps us monitor how much CO2 is in the water, which is what these guys need to grow. And we're also monitoring our temperature every kind of day for temperature. That gives us an indication of if we have any issues with flow or if we have any issues with our chiller as well. So for our salinity, we're still looking at around 30 parts per thousand on our refractometer. For our pH, with our pH probe, we're looking at around 8. And for our temperature, we're aiming to keep it around 12. But a swing of maybe 1 degree isn't so bad. In this little piece that we have under the microscope, we're seeing some really nice gametophyte growth. We're seeing some good size and really good numbers of them, and they look really healthy. We don't see any contamination under here at all, and we're actually seeing some sporophytes, some blades starting to emerge from these gametophytes too. So as we're doing our checks, we're kind of looking out for any signs that our spools might be contaminated, and what we're looking for in that is really any filamentous algae that's growing on there. So it might just be like some really long filaments that are growing, or you might start to see some really fuzzy pieces growing on your spools. And that indicates that there was some contamination that managed to get through our cleaning phase. There are a couple of ways to mitigate this. If it's diatoms, we can add some germanium dioxide into the water. Otherwise, we can spot clean some of the spools. I've had good success with that, simply just taking out the spools and dripping on a couple of drops of hydrogen peroxide and letting that soak in for a few minutes and then replacing the spool back into the aquaria. So now that we're a couple of weeks in, we can add some more nutrients into the water. And as a reminder, the full strength would be 10 mils of Part A and 10 mils of Part B for every 20 gallons. So we have about 160 gallons here, so we're not going to put in 160 mils of the nutrients. We're going to do about 80 mils. That's going to give us half strength. The gametophytes don't need as much nutrients at this point, and the half strength really helps mitigate some potential contamination growth as well. So we can add that half strength in today, and then maybe next time when we see the sporophytes starting to emerge, we'll add in a full strength mix of the nutrients. Okay, so we are at week 7 of the process, so it's been a couple of weeks since we last looked at the spools. So at this point in time, we should be seeing some color on the spools. I believe we saw some last time, so that was good, although they were quite small. So now we're getting quite big pieces and big dots of gametophytes, which is fantastic. In this little piece that we have under the microscope, we are actually seeing a nice sporophyte, which is a kelp blade, emerging from the gametophyte that's on the kelp spools, which is fantastic. It looks really healthy. We can even see the cell structure in there, so you can actually see the divisions between all the cells, which is pretty cool to see. And you can see that it's a nice healthy brown color, and it's a good size too. So these spools are due to be collected a week from now, so we will just continue to give them light, water, nutrients, and they should continue to look really good, and some will improve in that week, which is even better. So once we're out at the site and we're doing the outplanting, it's fairly simple. We already have the culture line set out in a lot of sites, and then what happens is we take our kelp spool, we run the line through the center of the spool and pull it out the other end, and then we take this extra line, unhook it, and we splice this into the culture line, and then we simply run this along the culture line, and this kelp spool plays out around it, and then in about 6 to 8 months we'll have a nice little piece of kelp to be able to harvest and take back and use for so many different things at this point. There's some cool innovations in the space, so it's pretty exciting.